case. And thank you, Patrick, for posing those good questions and for inviting me. I learned a lot from trying to prepare to answer your questions. Not all of them, but some of them. So I wanted to mention, this is an image illustrated, drawn by Hilary Kobe-Sasson, who's Saskia Sasson's son, who's an artist and a filmmaker. And it's to illustrate a story that Saskia Sasson wrote, a parable about a monster that lives on liquid gold that takes over cities, that burrows in to cities, and then shows up with a kind of exoskeleton throughout the city. And I thought it was an apt image and an apt story you might want to look up for what we're talking about today. And of course, it's not happening in every city, but it's important to recognize the dynamics of this and what it means for different types of cities. I also thought it would be interesting, since Saskia Sasson is sort of the inheritor of the Rosa Luxemburg / Karl Marx mantle of theory about capitalism and crisis, to just point out that there is always a boom and there is a bust in capitalist systems. And what we're seeing right now as a boom could someday be a bust. I think Torre David in Caracas as an example of big structures built that later bust. But this dynamic of capital accumulating, getting disconnected from production, and then either being devalued or removed from those systems is likely to happen in these cities that are currently receiving a lot of global capital at some point. So what I'm going to recommend, my basic argument today, and I see myself as an activist as much as an academic, so I'm talking to the heads of public agencies and to lots of environmental groups and NGOs around the Bay Area, is that we have to understand and work with the way that cities have been ranked into tiers. Now, I don't mean accept it, I mean subvert it. But we have to recognize that this tiering, this ranking has occurred, and that it's affecting the topology, not the typology, but the connectedness of capital flows around the world. This kind of report from the Qatar Financial Center shows us how the financial community ranks cities. This is the ranking of global financial centers, and you can dig into it. It is this very funny visual language of golf. At the same time, it's telling us about all these different cities and why you might invest in one or the other. It's, to me, hilariously disconnected, but I'm sure not to the other readers of this particular report. So London is number 1 in 2015, recently replaced New York. San Francisco was number 9, Vancouver's number 18. You can see the tiers right away in the ranking, and it goes down to 100. And those are the cities that they actually bothered to pay attention to. Within North America, New York is well above all the other cities that are ranked in terms of capital flow and good places for capital to be parked. And you can see the tiering in this graph very quickly. The numbers on the vertical axis are the scores in an index that this Qatar Financial Center uses, which is partly a kind of a crowdsourced index among people in the finance world and partly based on metrics. Metrics like infrastructure. Infrastructure metrics I've just highlighted with the green box, the ones that I think are so important. You can see they're a small proportion of the list, but being able to demonstrate environmental performance and be competitive in global sustainability are at least 2 of the variables that these organizations are looking at. And then other groups like McKinsey annually inform us about the flows of capital and how they're changing around the world. And what we see occurring, of course, is increases in the amount of capital flowing on a global basis, although some relationships begin to not be as significant. For example, the US, Western Europe, I think they really mean North America, and Western Europe. That relationship seems to be a little smaller in the larger global context of some new relationships between, for example, China and Latin America. So we see changes happening in these topologies. And we also see a kind of league of cities. That was my first thought after reading Saskia Sasson and looking at these kinds of analytical diagrams, was that there is a group of cities that are at play in this. And what if we as the citizens of those cities would begin to talk about how we could ally ourselves and figure out how to take advantage of the flow of capital and not be subjected to it as a passive receiver. And I thought of the history of the Hansa merchants, who, of course, traveled around the Baltic and the North Sea area, exchanging goods. They actually, the cities that participated in that particular league had their own armies. They would defend their trade routes with those local armies, and they had their own kind of parliament and a diet, it's called then. And that was another interesting thing to find out, that there was an alliance of those cities. And while I was thinking to myself, oh, this would be such a good idea, I thought, oh, there already is an alliance of cities. It's the Clinton C40 alliance that we hear a lot about, at least in the US, about how the Clinton Foundation has pulled all these cities together to try to reduce our carbon emissions and try to coordinate cities and reward excellence and provide funding. And I had thought that was really what it was all about until the last couple of years, because it does say they're trying to empower cities to connect with each other, and cities seem happy to be in the Clinton C40. And then I actually read the website, and they're focused on this thing I've highlighted, or they put the bold text in there, that the transformation of cities into a new economy, investing in different transportation, more efficient buildings, waste management. I like how they've added the adjective vast. Like we wouldn't know that 17 trillion was a big number, but represents a vast 17 trillion opportunity worldwide. Now, I always think of adaptation as a cost. It never occurred to me that someone else is out there moving a lot of money around and saying adaptation is this vast opportunity. So if you look a little deeper into the C40 language, they use the word lucrative as an opportunity for the private sector, that we're talking about a lot of capital support for projects that are about adaptation, and a lot of yield. I love what they bold. Yielding 2,000% return. 20 times return on, that's easier to say, on the 1 million invested in each project. And what's really interesting is that the last part of it that I've highlighted below with the red is that they're focused on these barriers. The thing that prevents us all from benefiting from this vast 17 trillion opportunity for the private sector is the difficulties of procurement and conflict of interest challenges. I can't imagine why there would be any challenges produced by conflicts of interest in this situation. So it's very clear that they know what the problem is, and they're putting it right up front for us. They're clearly not talking to us on this website. They're talking to people from the private sector. And then each city, for example, Vancouver, has a section where it's described by the Clinton C40 Alliance, and there's a focus on climate performance. I don't find those graphs very informative. I don't know about you. Maybe over time they're going to show us trends and become very informative. But here's what I think is informative. Oh, sorry, let me go back one. They're showing us all these little facts about Vancouver as if it's a tourism website, as if you'd need to know how much rainfall there is to be able to understand CO2 emissions. And then they have a little thing up here, contact C40 about Vancouver. So they're basically advertising this city as something you can invest in. Look at all these fantastic things about the city and contact us so we can be your broker. And that's what C40 really is brokering private financial investments in cities. It's one of the services that have developed, in a sense, around all of this global capital flow. And what they focus on is the executive power of the mayor, not the level of citizen participation, not social equity, but the power of the mayor, because if you're in the private sector and you want to get something done, you need an executive who will get that done for you. And if it's a city with a weak mayor, you don't have a partner. If it's a city with a strong mayor, ideally somewhat dictatorial, you would have a great partner. And then there's always our suspicions about where the money comes from for the Clinton Foundation and how it's related to other things going on around the world. Not to get paranoid, but there it is. Who else is a broker? This organization, CityAge, is a broker. They're traveling around the world. You may know some of the founders. I think one of them was from here in Vancouver, was involved in government. And now he and a partner have founded this private company, a for-profit company, to help us. Well, us is the wrong word. Let's see what who they're helping. 4,500 decision makers, thought leaders, and investors who are building our economy and society. Okay, now I get it. We're talking about having the people who run these companies and make these investment decisions actually build our society. Okay, let's just make it super clear. And when they come here to Vancouver, I hope you'll all try to go and find out who these thought leaders are that are building our society. Sidewalk labs. I just was at a kind of chilling presentation by Dan Doctoroff, who's the CEO of Google's Sidewalk Labs. And they are, of course, trying to figure out, well, what they say about themselves is that they are building products addressing big urban problems. It's a fascinating situation that Google has decided to invest in addressing big urban problems by turning cities into R&D labs. And from autonomous vehicles to building code, Sidewalk Labs is thinking about problems and solutions that could shape cities for centuries. So this is not a flash in the pan. We're talking here about restructuring cities for a very long time. And if you dig somewhat into it, here is the team that leads Sidewalk Labs. And Dan Doctoroff is, of course, the CEO. You might not recognize his name, but he was Bloomberg's development czar in New York during the period of time when huge development projects and flows of global capital came into New York. And he's a character that I wouldn't necessarily describe as evil, but he's about as close as I can imagine coming to evil. And still, you know, not being in, well, evil people don't go to jail, so I won't even mention prison. This is the car, the Lexus version of the Google car, that's the driverless car that's driving around the Bay Area now, in the San Francisco area. And when Doctoroff told us about what it is that they're doing at Sidewalk Labs, he made it very clear that they're not an R&D company, really. They're a media company. What is a media company? A media company is kind of a PR firm. A media company tries to persuade you about what's happening in the world and what you should think about it and how you should feel about it. So what they're really doing with Sidewalk Labs is preparing us all for Google's big money-making opportunity, which is to own the franchise for particular cities' driverless vehicles. That's the business opportunity that automakers and Google are competing for. And Google is the closest to operationalizing something like that. And their vision is not that these driverless cars will be out there with us all driving, because they've discovered that it's actually dangerous for both driverless and driver-occupied cars to be on the street together. They're actually picturing at some point that these driverless cars will completely replace human-driven cars. Not in the distant future, but in the relatively near future. So they're setting up our national highway administrations to give grants to think about adapting cities to this vast investment and franchising opportunity. So here was the resistance to Doctoroff in New York, and I think it's instructive to see, you know, who was willing to take him on. Majora Carter took on this issue about the challenge was to Doctoroff's plan to locate a new jail in the South Bronx, a new prison facility. And she wanted a recycling center. She was an activist, a community activist who wanted a recycling center. And she basically accused him of being Robert Moses, of ignoring the needs of local people. And his response was that she's a NIMBY person, that she needs to accept what she gets, because we have to put these things somewhere. So no recognition at all about social justice or environmental justice and the legacy of certain neighborhoods getting the negative uses over and over again. And if that's who's running the driverless cars program, I think our hopes that it might be a leveling effort for access in cities may not be true. New York, as one of those, the number 2 right now, city receiving capital in the world, got this kind of public space as an iconic public space. This is, of course, the High Line project that Corner and others designed. And this kind of public space was part of the sort of ornamental component of Doctoroff's projects to do real estate development. The High Line is successful, or was built, because of all of the real estate development happening right around it. So it's a project that's really not a standalone. It's part of a whole redevelopment of that part of New York. Quite a high, top dollar redevelopment effort. Flint, Michigan got this. So we see the tiers of cities. I would say New York is obviously tier 1. It's the number 2 city receiving capital flows in the world. Flint has to be a tier 3 or 4. And we have to figure out, as designers and planners, how to actually respond. What should our strategies be in these different kinds of cities? The cities that are basically being cut off and let go versus the cities that are receiving capital. And it's not the same strategy. It can't be. Then there's a kind of tier 2. I think of tier 2 as, I would include San Francisco in this, cities that are receiving the investment money as venture capital, not just as real estate, but as venture capital. Seattle receives a lot of venture capital money for tech startups in software, for widgets, for gadgets, and for biotech. So tech includes biological components as well as software and electronic devices. And what's interesting is, I just wanted to reflect on 10 years ago what Seattle was like, not now, but 10 years ago there was a woman named Nancy Malmgren who used to show up at the city council meetings dressed in a salmon costume to advocate for salmon-bearing streams in the city. And I want to contrast this to the kind of iconic development that we see happening around the country and around the world, iconic design, this kind of citizen activist-based sort of sweet design. And these two women, this could be told as a story of two Pegs, Peg Gaynor and Peg Stahaley, started the natural drainage program that was the stormwater program for the city of Seattle. They personally started it and then operated politically to make it happen. Doing pro bono work, doing all kinds, they're both landscape architects, but they created this program from outside the city walls by befriending lonely women engineers within the public infrastructure organization. And it worked really well. They did a bunch of projects that now look dated and old. But what's interesting about them to me is that they were very body scale. They were very much about the embodied aesthetic experience. They were almost residential. They were really residential scale. They used residential plants. They were an infrastructure idea of extending infrastructure into everybody's yard, into everybody's street front. And it's sweet. Not only is it sweet, but it was performance-based. It was focused on success if it performed. And so when they tested the first one and it performed very well, they began to build more. That was the criterion. Not was it iconic and appealing in promotional literature, but was it performing as it was designed to perform? This is another project, and I'm just going to quickly show a big public housing project in Seattle that was redeveloped. It's still an interesting project, and it was a kind of micro-topography project. It used this planting strip as the infrastructure. They dug down 10 feet, they filled it with engineered soil, they used that not instead of pipes completely, because they did put pipes in to make sure nothing would fail, but they developed a technology they could build over and over again. This is our R&D, this is urban R&D. The stormwater utility spent $4 million to test this idea here. That's what I think of as urban R&D. And then they had identified performance goals, and they tracked and monitored performance of how those engineered soils and micro-topography interventions actually performed. So I think that the irrational new normal that we see happening all around us is that we're seeing a design for iconic value instead of performance value. And even in places like Seattle, we're not seeing the focus on small scale, embodiment aesthetic, what you sense as you walk through a place. We're seeing more of the iconic scale. And we're certainly seeing that in the Bay Area too. I think the strategic new normal that we all could adopt is to try to use iconic value to create performance value. And I know that that's tricky and may fail. But I can't stop the flow of capital. All I can do is try to subvert it. So I'm trying to think of ways to do that. And that this is really about adaptation, not resilience, not sustainability. This is about adaptation, because the changes we're going to see in coastal areas and even in interior areas of the continents over the next 50 years are going to scare the pants off us. We are going to actually change cities, or we're just going to start abandoning pieces of them and come back and recolonize them later. So I work with typologies. I think it's been interesting, there's a little bit of a theme of the return of the typology in the presentations. I work with understanding adaptation designs, and I've categorized them into a set of designs that are really wall-based forms and a set of designs that are really landform-based. But both can be either dynamic or fixed. And we see examples around the world of walls that are fixed. Walls that are dynamic are more few and far between, but a simple tide gate is a dynamic wall too. It doesn't have to be the Rotterdam Barrier, the Maesland Barrier. Landforms, obviously dikes and canals are fixed. Mounds, all those structures are fixed. And dynamic things would be more like the sand engine, which I'll show you a couple of pictures of in a minute. or wetlands, which are meant to accrete and maybe erode, and then accrete and accrete higher and higher over time to keep up with sea level rise. Then I take that typology and I make it a four-dimensional space. I'm sorry, I occasionally do have to talk to the science community, so I'm thinking about a kind of solution space where we might be able to optimize hybrids of these different things that have more walls, more static, things that have more walls, more dynamic, strategies for a section of the shoreline that have more dynamic landforms or more static landforms. And I feel like someone needs to lay out this solution space, because in the engineering community, people are rushing to solutions instead of standing back and saying, wait a minute, what are the range of things that we could do? How could we combine them? And not to vilify or deify any particular strategy, but keep the floor open, because this technology is changing quickly. I want to show you a few cities that are doing iconic things and talk about this theme briefly of how iconic design investments might be subverted to be performance-oriented design investments. And that's maybe a little easier in the coastal area of work, but it's been a funny focus in the last 2 days too on skylines. A lot of people are using images of skylines, which of course is the marketing of the iconic. So I did that on purpose to try to emphasize that for each city. But in my skylines, of course, you'll see water as the foreground instead of an old neighborhood, which is, of course, the theme skyline of the event. This is the Thames Barrier sitting in the Thames River. That's central London is back here. Canary Wharf and all that is here. And the structure is really a series of towers that rotate a barrier into place that's normally resting in the riverbed. It's a very shallow river, so it's relatively easy to turn a structure on a kind of cam. And the design of it, that was influenced by the Greater London Architecture Office when it existed, it's been disbanded, was to do the protection from corrosion by adding this stainless steel cladding over the tower. And of course it won a prize from the stainless steel people, obviously. But from the other side, this is the photo you never see of the Thames Barrier. From the other side, you can see they did something else, which to my mind is unusual. The engineers that I work with would never have aligned this aperture and this aperture in a symmetrical way, using a bilateral symmetry. They just wouldn't have done it, it's not necessary. This might have been symmetrical, but when you add them all up together, everything has a bilateral symmetry emphasized by the crest of the cladding. To me, there's likely to be a reason for that. Every person educated in the UK has seen something of the archaeological materials found at Sutton Hoo. This is a helmet from a 7th century Anglo-Saxon warrior that was found and cleaned up from the Sutton Hoo archaeological dig. To me, it has a lot of resonance with the structure of the barrier. And when you see the barrier at night, it's lighted like a hearth. It's lighted as if you're returning from the sea to the fires of home. So the language becomes a language of a kind of native warrior defending the city. And that's pretty good. That's a good sale. They have made a good sale there with iconic design that's actually performance-based and highly monitored and will eventually be adapted. It's a very popular barrier. It's the most popular barrier I know of in the world. You can find a lot of videos of it on YouTube. People drive by in a Zodiac and record it. Let's look someplace else, Osaka. Again, water in the foreground. Used to be a reflecting pool to reflect the power and design control of big skyscrapers. Now kind of an urgent need to understand it and be ready. It's not going to be our friend in the future in the same way. So in Osaka, they built the super dike. They used an economic downturn in a kind of Keynesian way to invest in public infrastructure. And they built this huge, well, widened. It was already a 30-foot high dike along the river there. They just widened it a lot and then put terraces on the back to be able to trap any overtopping water that came over. And they extended everybody's property lines up through the new massive material, which now basically can't fail. It could be overtopped, but it can't catastrophically fail. And it created a new plinth for iconic architecture. They didn't actually build iconic architecture in Osaka, but they could have. A super dike could be a plinth for exactly what the flows of capital, the liquid gold, want to make. And it can make everyone else safer, People back here in these original buildings are safer because of this, which suggests the potential of a kind of Robin Hood strategy. This is what it looks like from the air. Rotterdam. The sand engine is actually north of, arguably it's The Hague, not Rotterdam, but I always approach it from Rotterdam, so I'm sort of lumping it in with what's happening there. It's a huge amount of sand. It's 28 million cubic yards, which is between 3 and 5 times larger than any sand nourishment project ever done in North America. So it's a lot of sand, and most of it is underwater. This is the part that makes it cheap. This is cheaper to do than placing sand all along the whole coast every year, which is the old strategy, because it's cheaper to place more sand in deeper water. You just dump it out of the bottom of the boat, the dredge boat, instead of having to spray it and rainbowing, or even more expensive, push it up onto the beach with big pipes. So the idea of it is place the sand in a big lump and let the wind and the waves do the work of moving the sand up and down the coast, widening the sandy shoreline and allowing the Netherlands to have a robust edge even as sea level rises. This will have to be done, we think, or they think, every 15 years maybe more often. There's actually been more motion than people expected in the sand. But it's being monitored very, very carefully. And a 3D model, really a 4D model, of how sand moves has been augmented with these data, which will then be sold to all of us, is already being sold to all of us by Dutch consultants who develop models of sand transport and sell them all over the world. And the Bay Area is using that model now, and will continue to feed information into it from this prototype project. So what I like about this as an iconic design made into a performance design is that it was originally supposed to be in the shape of a tulip. The original proposal was a tulip island off the coast. And you can find the images of that online. It's kind of funny, because it would have looked like a tulip for all of a week, maybe. And then it would have been completely reshaped, like the tail of a comet, as water moved that sand around. It was sort of a pointless tulip idea. But when they shaped it into a hook instead, and a spit shape, and put it on the coast itself, that's because they thought that would perform better. And it still has iconic value. Although if they ever form a Friends of the Sand Engine group that wants to preserve its original form, you know that it's failed. Because this is supposed to teach us about the beauty of change, not teach us to try to put the sand back where it was last weekend when I brought my kids out to be on the beach. This is one of projects that I talk a lot about in the Bay Area. This is in Nesselande, which is in the sort of metropolitan part of Rotterdam. And what I like about it, other than wondering if that woman dresses that way every day, I don't know, it's possible that it's not staged, is that it's in what could function as an expression of the water table. It's in a pond that's always wet. And this is not a floating house. This is a house on pile foundations, which is in a wet area, which can also function to store stormwater. So this is a house in the stormwater infrastructure. This is a house that allows people to see where the water table is and to be able to function as part of the flood management system. I like that. Again, suggesting us a Robin Hood strategy, where we could actually sell houses or rent them that are in our infrastructure system and that serve to protect others. And then this, I don't know how real this is. Maybe I'll get a show of hands from Dutch people in the room. How real is this project? This is a proposal that was used as a speculative, iconic proposal. But what's interesting about it, I mean, the basic idea was that it would be luxury hotel, luxury apartments, a kind of Ferris wheel like the Eye of London, but that this piece in here that looks like a kind of harp, that would be electrostatic wind energy generation, a whole new version of the Dutch windmill. And that this project would be something that would be funded and actually built in the water. So there it is with its foundations right in the harbor, the old harbor, not the oldest harbor, but one of the areas of the harbor that are no longer used for ships. So this is the kind of building we may see a lot more of. In fact, we'll see more of it in Hamburg. In Hamburg, they built an iconic building. Herzog and de Meuron designed the Elbe Philharmonic Hall, placing this kind of confection of glass on top of an old warehouse. And the symphony hall is in there, but don't be fooled that the symphony hall is in the prow of this shape. It is not. It's in the back, Luxury apartments are in the prow of this hall that are essentially trophy apartments. Maybe somebody will occupy them, but it's all part of encouraging people in Hamburg to say, we are still the people of the ship. We are still the Hansa merchants. We can maintain a container port that is the second largest in Europe, I believe still, in the heart of the city. That's what they've been doing. But by trying to maintain a container port in the heart of the city, they've created a situation where the floods from the North Sea actually are coming downhill into Hamburg and causing enormous flooding problems in the area that used to be old warehouses. So what they've done is built the Hafen City district, where in these illustrations from a colleague of mine, Antje Stockmann, you can see there's a walkway here next to the water. Here's the warehouse that they built that Philharmonic Hall on. And the first floor of all these buildings is hardened and waterproofed. There are waterproof parking garages in there, which is kind of amazing. Here's what happens over time. You can see the tide come up. It's still just on the face of that seawall. And then it reaches, in the flood, a new level beyond to flood that pedestrian walkway. And what families do is they put their cars in the waterproof parking garages, except for these people who must have gone to Malaga and not gotten the email. And families actually stay. They don't evacuate. They stay and they take the kids down to see the storm, the flood. How much better is that, to actually look at the environment you live in and get to know the dynamics instead of having to evacuate or live behind walls? Much, much better as a model. And the new competitions and housing in that Hafen City district will be for buildings with foundations in the water, mid-rise. And this is the Studio Gang version, which came in third, but I think they're actually going to build this prototype as well. So let me very quickly say something about San Francisco Bay, and I'll stop for questions. Another iconic water photo. We are looking at significant sea level rise. With only 16 inches of sea level rise, all these light blue areas would be flooded. That's our entire wetland environment that we have spent, that environmentalists have spent, and federal government, lots and lots of money over the last 30 years to restore. So all that would go down the tubes, because those wetlands will collapse into mudflats as they're submerged by sea level rise, and the habitat of wetlands will go away. Not to mention the investments and homes of something like 250,000 people. The Googleplex is down here. The highway system would be interrupted in probably 50 places. It's an incredible impact to think about what would really happen if as that does occur, if we don't respond. And it's already happening. This is the Embarcadero in San Francisco, and this is just a high tide. This is not a storm. This is just an astronomical high tide, the high tide of the year in downtown San Francisco. So we're right on the verge of very expensive real estate being flooded and important roadways. At the same time, capital is flowing into the San Francisco Bay Area and creating new development. Treasure Island is part of the city of San Francisco, and the mayor of San Francisco made it very clear to consultants working on that project that at a certain point they had to stop talking about sea level rise until he could line up all the capital, and then they could talk about sea level rise, once the investments were already made. This is an artificial island, which is now going to be home to 8,000 to 10,000 units of housing. It's all done. It's permitted. This is going to happen. And it's vulnerable to the first tsunami that might come from an earthquake through the bay, and it's vulnerable to sea level rise. It's about a meter, maybe 2 at the highest above the bay level. And again, as I said, it's all made land, so it's going to have other issues with waterlogging and how it behaves in an earthquake. So the question is, can we manipulate global capital flow into housing, which is where it's coming in the Bay Area, and simultaneously build a new protective and biodiverse shoreline? And that's the challenge. These wetlands that are so important to the Bay Area, we've been studying and we've learned how they do reduce storm surge. They do reduce wave energy, so we can use them in a performative way. And this is the proposal, to actually irrigate the wetlands from the top with sewage effluent, treated sewage effluent, which has nutrients in it, to put those nutrients into a brackish wetland at the top, and then at the bottom, to actually add silt in front of these wetlands and have the waves bring silt up onto the wetland top, which would be kind of a silt engine. A little more modest in the American context, smaller particles. And beaches. This is Crissy Beach at Crissy Field. And it actually shows the accumulation of sand there. It's one of the few accreting beaches in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's accreting naturally because of a funky thing where big waves come up from the South Pacific and curl around the Golden Gate. But we can use artificially accreted beaches to make a sand barrier island, which allows, in this case, this is the new site of the University of California up here. They're going to do an international campus there. This is a sand barrier island, and what it would do would be to accelerate the accretion of wetlands behind it by limiting wave energy. So by manipulating some of the way that the sediment works, we can manipulate the shape of the shoreline. This one was a proposal by a student of mine for adding a beach, in a particular case a huge beach, in an area where there's housing right now right on the water's edge that will be flooded and has a very kind of limited, somewhat ineffective seawall. So adding beaches, they're a recreational opportunity, they're an opportunity to protect urban development, and basically the whole strategy ends up maybe buying us time. We can't probably do it forever, although the Dutch plan to, and we'll learn from them about how you can do it forever. But the proposal that I'm making in the Bay Area is that we think of the shoreline as a series of kind of micropolders, truly small, where we can try some pilot projects that bring in new housing indicated in the orange color, in these groundwater ponds that function as a kind of cellular stormwater infrastructure for flooding, mostly from tributaries, because we can't solve that problem very easily. We have to figure out how to handle flooding from the tributaries that come into the bay. Add beaches for recreational and habitat value, and add wetlands to be able to have a living edge that's paid for by new luxury housing. I think that's fair. And having things like this, when I showed this to the man who's the head of the Bay Commission board, he's very excited about it. And he wants me to do a case study that explains this to everybody in the Bay Area because he thinks it can make money. And this looks a little weirder to him, but it's a possibility. We could talk about mid-rise. That might actually happen. So thank you for hearing about those examples, and I look forward to a few questions. Look at that, right on time, pretty good.
Thank you for the presentation. It was so exciting to hear a positive spin on some of these global processes. My question is, and it might be a bit unfair, but thinking about how we harness these flows of capital in terms of an equity lens, and obviously there's an equity aspect to climate change and climate change adaptation, but do you have any thoughts on how you can apply it to a broader context and think about equity more generally in urban areas?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a tier 3 city, what I've been calling a tier 3 city, good luck, because you will not have the capital to be able to do these kinds of adaptation strategies. It's much more likely that people will do floating houseboats, they'll have non-functional sewage systems. They're already in non-functional infrastructure settings anyway. But we'll see a lot of failed systems as well, and small towns along the coasts. I really don't know over the long term what they're going to do. I think there's going to be a lot of relocation. Some of that is second houses, so it's not an equity problem, second homes. And I don't want to see us spend a single public dollar on second homes. But I do think that there's an opportunity to offer things like revolving loan funds to lower income homeowners and even renters to be able to improve their properties, to elevate them, rather than build levees and flood walls and pump systems. Because I know that those levees and flood walls and pump systems will fail eventually in a climate of people not doing maintenance and monitoring, as they did in New Orleans. And I know that many of the low-income communities around the United States had no opportunity to borrow money in the 1920s, 30s, up to the 60s, and maybe even extending into today because of phenomena like redlining, where communities were prevented from getting loans because they had brown skin or they were the wrong religion. So we can correct some of that. I think of adaptation as an opportunity to try to level some of the playing field and not take the status quo into the future. And we can say that a lot, but what we really need is for credible community organizations, people of color, to come forward and lead people's adaptation councils, go to the mic and demand that these adaptation solutions try to address inequality. And then the technical people, more on my side, can make that happen. But we have to have people who are willing to go to the microphone and say, you know, you're screwing us again, and you've got to stop doing that. There is going to be a very interesting problem with groundwater, which I didn't talk about in the interest of time. As sea level comes up, the freshwater lens of the water table rises on top of it. And in communities that have a history of soil contamination, that contamination is going to be remobilized. And the people who suffered cancer and other diseases from those contamination exposures in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, until recently, will suffer again. Some of them have been replaced by rich people as gentrification occurs, and they'll suffer too. So we have to address a number of legacy issues, and I think that that's the way to get at some of these things, is to consider whether we do public infrastructure as a solution, I don't think we always should, or whether we provide people with money to improve their homes, and then we improve their roadways and their sewage systems. But gentrification is a dynamic that, as you know, goes on without us being able to completely stop it. That's a much bigger policy question than what I've tackled. I just want to make sure that my particular proposals don't cause more inequity and hopefully do a little bit of good for people who have been trying to get loans.
Okay, hello there. Who's next? I have a practical question. Thank you so much for your presentation, very innovative ideas. So I'm involved in politics in my community, and I just have a practical question of how do you bring these innovative ideas? If you give a couple of examples, do you sit down, I'm just going to be really practical here, politicians, do you have a coffee with them and say, I have some ideas, or do you have a venue where you bring your presentation? You were talking about that you showed somebody these ideas. So just from a very practical point of view, politicians have no time, as you know, they're overwhelmed. They're the ones who have to approve these kinds of things, or approve funding, or there's different committees. So just wondering if you have a couple of practical examples of
if you're not already connected to the actual elected official, head of agency, or the people who organize City Age, it's worth talking to the staff of the elected officials. That's often where I've started. And I've been fortunate to get some media attention, so the staff sometimes come to me. And then it'll be, you have to do something for them like 3 times before you actually meet the elected official. And then eventually you meet the elected official once they've decided you're not a crazy lunatic and they don't want to be photographed with you. So it takes a while to actually get to the elected official, but there are people out there who've decided they want to be on the hope side of this, not on the doom and gloom side of this, and those are the people that you want to be talking to their staff, sharing examples of ideas that you can back up with more information. And I also do a lot of speaking to community groups, because I find that there'll be some older woman in the audience or older man who decides to make this their issue and then goes to their elected officials who they've given money to in the past and tries to get them onto this. And also public agencies. There are lonely, good technical people at public agencies who could use a coffee. And that is what the private sector does. That's what they do. They go talk to those people. So we need to figure out how to talk to those people too.
Can you hear me? I think the equity question is very complex in the United States, and there's the rich communities and the have-not communities. But I'm an education facility planner as well as an urban planner. But one of the things I've noticed in the States is there's also poor schools and well-to-do schools.
Because it's local funding.
Yes, and it's basically you have to have local bonds, and if there's no support, then you don't get it. So how do you see that? Do you think there's a need for transformation in the system in the United States in terms of, there needs to be some change to create better.
Don't get me started.
Okay.
There are so many things that need to be changed. And since I can't change those things, I'm focused on helping to change things on the ground to the extent that I can. But yeah, there are a lot of things that need to be changed. And, you know, we've descended into a situation where, because of 30 years of effort on the part of the private sector to reduce the number of people who are in the public sector getting paid to work for the public. This has taken 30 years. You know, the Reagan administration was a while ago, to totally gut public agencies. I work with agencies now that have almost no staff. And they rely on these pro bono projects by private companies that are feathering their own nest. They have almost no staff. And what's happened, really, not to be too much of a conspiracy theorist, but when you look at it, they've gutted the public sector. And so now the private sector can rush in with city age and say, they're building our society for us, with no oversight by the public, because there's no one else to do it. They need our help. But it's totally self-serving, because that's the same community that's voted for Republicans who have gutted the public sector. You take all of its teeth out, and then you wonder why it can't chew.
You asked earlier about City Age and the Vancouver connection. Muriel Sertnig, one of the two founders, is a journalist and wrote for the national newspaper that I used to work for here, and saw the end of that tunnel and jumped off and formed it. They don't want local participation.
I'm not surprised.
It's only global hot capital. So there is, very interestingly, these global currents of information and opinion.
Yeah, they've invited me to
touch down in only certain places.
Yes.
And Vancouver is buying into that game in a big way by putting a lot of public money, millions of public dollars, into attracting the TED conferences here, et cetera. So I think you could map those flows of information or information generation institutions. Just a quick comment. I was in Phnom Penh a couple of weeks ago, which is a fascinating city that I wasn't expecting a land and development boom there, but it's got one. And for them, crazy land prices, et cetera. With the specter of the damming of the Mekong River, which is going to have enormous hydrological effects all through Southeast Asia. Now, this just strikes me as that, based on your talk, one wants to produce kind of global images of geo-economic morphology. In other words, eating away at places like Bangladesh and hunks of Cambodia, because they don't have the capital to preserve or enhance landscapes. And then the aggrandizement of those places with, and I'm just curious if has anyone sat down and done a big picture, a rendering of world transformed by these forces?
I haven't seen that. I've seen artists doing maps, network maps of how, for example, the Bushes and the Saudis are connected and all of these other pieces, but nobody has done it yet in terms of the physical world, but they should. And you know, it's possible. Saskia Sassen, who I've been reading for the last few years since I saw her give a lecture, was writing recently about commodity cities, the cities where the raw materials come from. And maybe that really should be tier 3, and then Flint, Michigan would be even tier 4 below them. Because the dynamics of places where you get your water, places where you get your lithium, places where you get your other commodities, those are very important and differently affected by the flows of capital.
Hi, Kristina. Any student want to ask a question?
Hi, I'm a MUD student here, and this year we'll be working on the City of Surrey project, and we are specifically working in the Whalley area. Whalley is the northwest region of Surrey, and it's mostly industrial zone, and it's near the Fraser River. So it's also, the most of the part of that region is at the floodplain or at the verge of flooding. Mm-hmm. But my question is that they have some existing industrial works or industrial lands near those floodplain or those near to the Fraser River. How we tackle those private sector or that industrial existing industrial businesses to, okay, either make some gentrification or either just move and maybe just introducing something more sand, and there's some kind of a existing occupancy as well over there, and which experiences floods, as we talk about this officials, that they experiences floods not every year, but in mostly like 3-4 years. Mm-hmm. But the people the community doesn't want to move. They have some social and or really cultural bonding to that place, and they don't want to move. So what do you think would be the right solution for that space?
Well, I don't know if this is the right solution for that place or for industrial areas generally. I mean, the supply chains of all manufacturing are going to be affected by flooding because they're all in flat places because they need a big floor plate. Those kinds of buildings need a big floor plate, and so they're in flat places that are going to be wet places. Maybe there'll be a typological change, or people will use more pumps and levees for those places in particular. It's a brittle thing, but it would at least only be flooding an industrial site, not flooding residential. The thing that strikes me about it, though, is that there will be places that we will, pardon the gambling analogy, we will double down. And I think that we'll be doubling down around our sewage treatment facilities. We'll be protecting those because they're billion-dollar investments that we have no place to relocate them to. And when we double down, which we will, to protect those kinds of facilities, maybe we should put some housing in there.
Yeah.
And if you decide that it's important to double down on that industrial location, put some housing in there. You might as well find a place for people to live who will be protected by whatever strategies will protect those private investments.
That makes sense.
I loved your talk, and I love the kind of moral, I love the obvious moral ambiguity of it all, and the concession to the reality part of it, so I totally applaud that as a preface to challenging you. And the challenge is, in a way, have you reflected on this possibility? If this depends on the 1% or the 0.01% as the economic driver for it, their physical footprint on the land is relatively small in comparison with the huge footprint that the middle class had, particularly in places like the United States, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So the internet system, the infrastructure of the suburbs, all that stuff was driven by the overwhelming geographical footprint of that class. In comparison, this is a tiny class. They have the wealth of Midas, but it lands in these tiny points. So have you reflected on that problem as a problematic potentially?
I'm not a valorist of the middle class, so it's not like I'm defending the middle class in all of this, but I think that the footprint of the 1% may be small where they actually live, but their capital has a big footprint. That capital needs to be parked somewhere in order to make more money. And so the Bay Area, Treasure Island, is entirely a result of the 1%. That's 8,000 to 10,000 units that are funded by foreign capital. And local politicians who are funded by some of that real estate development capital open the doors to make that happen. So the middle class is going to live there. Well, the upper middle class is going to live there in Treasure Island, not the 1%. Maybe the 1% will live in the penthouse apartments. But it's the 1% that makes a development deal, that makes the 20% return on investment, that pulls their money out as the units are sold. So that's, I would say, the real footprint of the 1%. And that's the pressure, that feeling of you can only say no to that much money so many times, and eventually someone will cave and say yes. And then the thing gets built.
Yeah, I agree with the thing gets built, and doing what you're talking about is doing God's work. You'll definitely get into heaven, but I'm still skeptical.
I'm an atheist, so that's
Well, that's the Irish Catholic in me. I'm always worried about what St. Peter's going to say.
Actually, what I'm really worried about is that there's reincarnation, and I'm going to have to suffer whatever I cause to make happen.
But I'm just reflecting on the conversation of the whole conference about how can we treat this thing as a landscape scale issue at the same time it's an equity issue, at the same time it's a climate change issue. I don't have the solution.
Yeah. Well, I actually think that these landform-based strategies, which will have to be mostly landform-based because they're cheaper, these landform-based strategies provide us with an armature for rethinking the landscape of the way this capital works. To create land that gets the investment, both for habitat and for human habitat and for non-human habitat and for flood protection. So I think that we can, by using landscape as something creatable, not something we have to fight over the last few parcels, but something creatable, I think that that's going to be the saving grace. Not to go back to your, religious language, but you've got me started.
Well, thank you, Christina. This
Okay,
was
thank you.
fantastic. Fantastic talk.